Welcome to Mormon Land from the Salt Lake Tribune, a podcast all about the news and culture of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I'm religion reporter Tamara Kimsley, and I'm joined by senior managing editor Dave Noyce. Hey, Dave.
Hello, Tamara.
Before we start, here's a quick ask. We invite you to go to patreon.com where you can access all the Tribune's faith coverage, ad-free, podcast episodes, and the full Mormon Land newsletter. Again, that's Patreon. patreon.com/MormonLand. And if you haven't already, follow us on Instagram at Mormon.land. Now for today's episode. A grassroots movement centered in Salt Lake City more than 40 years ago kept Utah and Nevada from hosting the world's largest nuclear weapons system. During the final years of the Cold War, a peaceful rebellion against the MX mobile missile saved the Great Basin from significant environmental impacts and helped change the course of the arms race. Aiding the activists was a powerful ally, the then president of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, President Spencer W. Kimball. In 1981, Kimball and his counselors, Apostles N. Eldon Tanner and Marion G. Romney, came out against the project in a lengthy statement that read in part, "Our fathers came to this western area to establish a base from which to carry the gospel of peace to the peoples of the earth. It is ironic and a denial of the very essence of that gospel that in this same general area there should be constructed a mammoth weapon system potentially capable of destroying much of civilization." Now, some of those same activists are agitating again, this time against the ongoing development, partially in Utah, of a new generation of nuclear missiles designed to replace an aging arsenal. Once again, they're looking for an assist from the church's top brass, now led by President Dallin H. Oaks. In an October letter mailed to the Faith's Salt Lake City headquarters, they called on the newly ascended prophet to condemn the Sentinel missile project. To date, the church has offered no response. How much impact would it have if they did offer one is unclear, and, according to political scientist Quinn Monson, depends a great deal on how it would be framed. Monson, a professor at church-owned Brigham Young University, joins us today to outline his research on how Latter-day Saint leaders can shape public opinion within their ranks. Welcome, Quinn.
Thank you. Glad to be with you.
So very first, you've written about the church leaders' involvement against the MX. Let's start there with what you found, and including how impactful, for instance, their message was on that issue.
Yeah, we wrote about this. I have a book with David Campbell and John Green called Seeking the Promised Land. And one of the chapters is about this very question about how influential the church can be on public opinion among Latter-day Saints in terms of can they actually move opinion. And the MX missile is an interesting case study because there's some opinion data back in the day where among Latter-day Saints, the opposition to the missile system was not particularly high early on, in part because it was backed by President Reagan. It was backed by the Republican office holders in the state, including Senator Orrin Hatch at the time. I think he was quite favorable, and it was people were supportive of it in part because it would bring a lot of jobs. It was a huge construction project that would occur in the West Desert of Utah and into Nevada, building this track system to move these missiles around. And I don't know the specifics of how influential this particular group was in terms of changing the church's position, or if they actually changed the church position or just got the church to say something. But what we know happened is that the church started dropping hints about this, and the breadcrumbs appear of all places in some holiday messages. So there's you get the sense because the church releases a Christmas message from the first presidency in December of 1980 that mentions nuclear weapons and the nuclear arms race, and then calls upon heads of government to sit down and reason together to resolve their concerns. So that, right amid the language about celebrating the birth of the Son of God, and how they would write a nice Christmas message, you have this paragraph about nuclear weapons and trying to get people to sit down together and resolve their differences. So clearly it's on somebody's mind, right? That they're talking about this in the middle of a Christmas message of all places. And you get the sense that the message isn't getting through because they come around again. And at Easter time, their Easter message has another sort of sentence or two about nuclear weapons. And finally, they issue this very long letter. It's several pages and quite detailed. I mean, it's way too long. You could spend several minutes reading the whole thing. They go into extraordinary detail about why they're opposed to the MX missile. So the lesson that we took from that as we undertook our research was, is there something to the fact that they were very general in their opposition, sort of cautionary language about nuclear weapons, blah, blah, blah. And then suddenly they issue this letter that is very detailed in its opposition, very clear in its opposition. And what happens is, you can call it circumstantial evidence, but it's pretty persuasive to me, is that public opinion shifts heavily against the MX missile. And public officials changed their positions, including, I believe, Senator Hatch changed his mind, and the governor, and everyone suddenly is against it. And it killed the project. I think the church's opposition was the catalyst that started a movement of opposition that eventually they just gave up on it and did something else. But the clear lesson to me is the specificity of the language. And then the other factor that's really important is it's coming from the church president who Latter-day Saints sustain as a prophet, seer, and revelator. And so, and it's unusual. The church doesn't issue letters about public policy issues very often. And so when they do, it's bound to be noticed and generate a lot of attention and a lot of talk.
Yeah, Quinn, I remember that letter when it came. It actually happened on my birthday, May 5th. So soon after Easter, and it did turn around public opinion in Utah, at least, like on a dime. We're going to return to a little bit of the MX debate here a little bit and what we can learn from that. But obviously wasn't the last time church leadership took a stance on a public policy issue that might be controversial. Walk us through some of the other maybe big ones in the years since that time. There have been many, of course, but
there's several there, and a lot of times they happen on ballot initiatives because they're explicitly nonpartisan. So, to my knowledge, they have not taken an explicitly partisan position for a long time. Church leaders, it's been since maybe the 1930s or 40s since a church leader took an explicit position. Maybe I think a church president may have endorsed a presidential candidate in the 50s or something, but the church has not taken a position in that regard for a long time, and they're not likely to. That's very unlikely. I would not expect that. But ballot initiatives are not partisan, and therefore are open to church involvement. When they see it as a moral issue, the church will speak out, and how they define moral issue is kind of up to them, right? A moral issue could be a lot of things. In recent years, the church has, I'm going back to the period between the MX and now, they have spoken out on parimutuel gambling in Utah in 1992. They were very specific. They did something similar in Idaho against a lottery a few years before that. I think it was in 88. Then they spoke out in Utah against parimutuel gambling and communicated their opposition through church leaders and local channels. They spoke out very forcefully on an immigration issue in the state of Utah, not on the ballot, but before the legislature. They sent some lobbyists to the legislature, and if you, this is widely reported in the Tribune and elsewhere that there was a whole cadre of lobbyists unusual even for the church, right? To have so many people lobbying so strongly on an issue. I believe that was in 2011 in the legislative session.
And what specifically were they lobbying for those who weren't
familiar? They eventually were lobbying for a bill. It's odd because, again, the pattern was, I think they saw, if you recall, I believe Arizona passed a pretty draconian piece of legislation on immigration in 2010. And the sponsor of that legislation was a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. He was a leader in the Arizona legislature, and there's a fairly large Latter-day Saint contingent in that legislature. And I think there was a movement to bring similar legislation to Utah. And the church started to gently speak out, kind of not quite as odd as the Christmas and Easter messages, but they would issue these public affairs statements that would say things like, we should treat each other as children of God. And they would be a little caveat about obeying the law and squaring themselves with the law, but treating each other kindly as children of God and so forth. But they weren't specific. They didn't name a bill until later. So they issued a number of these. It didn't seem to be working. And they finally issued a very specific statement that said something along the lines of, we support language like that and then they named a bill number. I don't remember the bill number, but SB something. And so they didn't quite endorse the bill, but they said, we favor something like this. It was very carefully worded. But we have really good evidence that it changed opinion. In that time period, we have opinion data that's on a panel where we ask respondents their attitude about immigration. At one point in time, you watch the church issue a bunch of statements, including this very specific one. And then we did another survey and you measure the attitudes of the very same respondents at 2 points in time. And the church members, especially the very active church members, shift in a more moderate direction. It's very clear evidence that there's something to the fact that when the church speaks out specifically, it matters.
It seems to matter also, Quinn, like I'm thinking of immigration, as to whether the statements are coming from the church public affairs department, still speaking for the church, versus a letter from the first presidency, correct?
Yeah, I don't think it's been spelled out very clearly for Latter-day Saints, but I think you could ask any Latter-day Saint to sort of rank a hierarchy of authoritative church leaders and church venues, and you'd get some mixture of the most important would be the church president in general conference or issuing some kind of a public letter. I mean, if you want to canonize it and put it in the Doctrine and Covenants, that's even a step higher, perhaps. But that, we'll save those for the rare occasions that it happens, right? But short of canonizing something and making it a section in the Doctrine and Covenants, a statement over the pulpit in general conference or a letter signed by the first presidency is pretty strong medicine for Latter-day Saints. If it comes from the public affairs office, I think an intelligent Latter-day Saint would, if they stopped and thought about it, they'd know that those public affairs employees, they don't issue anything without approval. But I think there are still church members that manage to rationalize that and say, well, if they really meant it, they would sign a letter and put their names on it or something, even though I think they really do mean it. So there's that. I think it is different if it happens in a regional conference or a local conference, or if it's local leaders. Is there a difference between a bishop or a stake president and an area authority, and a difference between an area authority and a member of the Quorum of the 12 or the first presidency? I think that's an informal way, but I think Latter-day Saints would sort of see a difference there. Might be subtle, but it would probably be visible.
Mormon Land will be right back.
What about social media, as we saw with COVID and vaccination?
Yeah, that's a good point, because I think part of the reason that I think they do social media in that context is there wasn't a general conference to do it in. And it's not like they're going to roll up their sleeves and take a shot in the arm, over the pulpit. So it lent itself in some ways in terms of both the timing and the visual nature of Facebook and Instagram to be able to take a quick video of President Nelson, rolling up his sleeves and getting a shot and encouraging people to get a shot. I think in the context of those social media posts, they also issued a letter, right, that encouraged people to get vaccinated. And that was pretty strong medicine. And they issued other statements that were suggestive of their policy stance, which was, don't use the church as a rationale to not obey. You can't use us as a religious reason to not obey vaccination mandates by the government, for example. I remember language like that being issued.
Quinn, you may not know, but is there any evidence that had any effect?
I don't know of any easy to obtain or easy to explain evidence, but I have seen some evidence. So I've seen survey experiment evidence where you deliver messages in the context of a survey and people respond. I've seen sort of state level or county level vaccination data that suggests that areas of high concentration of Latter-day Saints were more likely to get vaccinated. And that's despite the sort of pretty visible pushback that existed by some Latter-day Saints, right? You had some very surprising and kind of jarring rejection of that in some quarters of the church, which I was a little surprised by. You don't normally get people that are so overtly in opposition to a public statement like that, but you did see some of that back in the days of vaccination.
Yeah, let me go back to the MX statement. It seems, and we touched on this, so I want to expound on this a little bit more. I want you to. The MX statement seems much more direct, the one that was issued in May, and the language more in keeping with coming from religious leaders than many of the more recent First Presidency pronouncements on public policy issues.
Well, because they give a long sort of theological explanation for why they're opposed to it.
Right. Would that kind of approach be more effective? And we kind of touched on this in winning support from members than some that come across, frankly, quite loyally or legalistic?
I don't know. That's a good question. I'm not sure I have an easy answer. I don't know if tying it to a theological foundation, if it is an important element, or if the authority of the person making the statement is sufficient. I'm speculating now, but I think the authority is a pretty powerful part of what happens inside the Latter-day Saint culture. There's a high degree of respect for authority. And so I think when an authoritative figure makes a pronouncement, it at least gets people to pause and pay attention and take notice and reconsider their position. So I'll give you an example. There's a woman that lived in my neighborhood, an older woman. She's since passed away, actually, sadly. But at the time, I was assigned. I'm in the local LDS congregation. I was her. I don't know if we'd gone to ministering then or if it was still home teaching. But in any case, I was assigned to her, and as a consequence of that, we were Facebook friends. And I could see from her Facebook posts that she was very conservative and posting lots of stuff about the Trump administration and all sorts of things. And, just observing that online, I thought when the vaccinations came out and there was some opposition from conservative elements to vaccination, I thought, oh boy, I don't know if she's going to get vaccinated. And I chose to call her one day and just ask her, so, what do you think about getting vaccinated? And she said, oh, I got vaccinated. And I said, really? Tell me why. And she said, and I'll try to do her voice here. She said, President Nelson. And I said, really? And she said, yep, if he can do it, I can do it. And I thought, wow. So even though you did see a fair amount of opposition, I think that's in some ways exceptional and not the rule. I think the rule is what I see in the systematic data collection over the MX missile and the parimutuel gambling and the marijuana initiative that we haven't even talked about, that when the church speaks out specifically in opposition to something, there's a fair amount of movement among church members. Not everyone, not universally, but some movement for sure, and measurable to be sure as well.
So you just covered right there a wide range of topics. Do you think there's any category of topic that perhaps Latter-day Saints are less responsive to leadership's direction?
That's a great question. Yeah, because when you look at something like Proposition 8 in California or parimutuel gambling or something, the church is pushing a largely conservative membership to take a fairly conservative position. It's not like, so it's not surprising. Although, in the case of like Proposition 8, it wasn't just opposition to it. It was mobilizing people to campaign for it and donate money and so on. So it went well beyond just going to the ballot and voting a particular way. It was a lot of activity. I think the real test is, you see, and we have data on this in the state of Utah, when the church has come out in favor of anti-discrimination laws for LGBT folks, and both in Salt Lake City when they very first announced that. I think that was in 2009 even, or 2010. It was very quickly after Prop 8, and then a few years later when they announced their support of a statewide law. Right, it didn't come to a vote before the people, but it certainly influenced the legislature, I believe, and also, and actually, I have data on local elected officials and church statements influencing them if they're Latter-day Saints as well. But it does influence public opinion in that period. So you see when the church announces their support of something that is, left of center, or at least left leaning, or at least moderate. I don't know, you can define it in a lot of ways, but certainly not what the right wing of the church would have wanted. That it does push people that are pretty conservative back in the other direction. And so I think that's pretty powerful and kind of exceptional. I don't think that's necessarily true of evangelical Christians or of Catholics even that have a hierarchical structure that is kind of similar to Latter-day Saints. I think there's something unique about Latter-day Saints that makes them influenceable more so than other religious denominations even.
That's interesting. I was going to ask you, but this does sometimes sway the policy makers too.
Yeah,
like
I think
Latter-day Saints on Capitol Hill might be inclined to vote a certain way. Church says something emphatic, let's say. No one can dispute it, and it changes their minds or shifts
it can.
them.
I mean, I think the effects are smaller. So when we do the experiments in the context of a survey with elected officials and the general public, the effect sizes go down with the elected officials. They have much more well-developed attitudes and lots more reasons, and they got to represent their constituents and so on. But in the case of immigration, it wasn't just a statement. It was significant lobbying as well. The church got their hands a little dirty, and they were in the trenches really talking to legislators and pushing them and cajoling them as a lobbyist will do, right?
Yeah, and I think we may not have seen the end of the immigration debate either.
We'll see.
Either,
I mean,
right?
There hasn't been a lot about immigration from church leaders or the church at all in the last few years.
Something after Trump took office, and this became a real national issue, but there's no doubt the language changed a little bit in what they were talking about. But that kind of leads to one of my next questions, which is a lot's been written about how Americans' political identities are starting to overtake their religious identities, that they hold those much more closely and can't be swayed as much. Do you see that happening among Latter-day Saints?
Yes and no. And so, it's hard because when we try to measure political identity and measure religious identity in a comparable way, what I have seen is evidence that among Latter-day Saints, their self-reported religious identity is much stronger. So if they're just reporting their affinity to a political party or their affinity to their religious affiliation, their identity with their religious affiliation is significantly higher. The challenge is that it's a bit of an apples and oranges comparison because, for example, I don't think there's any doubt in my mind that if, as influential as Donald Trump has been on political matters among some parts of the Latter-day Saint community, that if he suddenly started speaking out about Latter-day Saint doctrine or criticizing Latter-day Saint leaders, I don't know that would have the effect that it's having on, say, immigration attitudes or attitudes about January 6th or whatever, right? So when he is speaking out about politics, it's a little bit unfair because the church is speaking so infrequently about political issues. And so generally they don't often, if ever, speak specifically about politics in the same way that elected officials do. And so it's not really a fair fight to expect the religious identity to overpower the political identity when the religious messages are about loving each other as children of God. And the political message is build a wall and deport them and very specific, right? And so, but if Donald Trump started saying, I don't like the Book of Mormon or something, that's not going to work. He's not going to have the same effect. One, because he won't speak very frequently about that. He's not going to endlessly drone on about that for weeks on end. And the church is going to react, and they've got a very clear position, and it's well known and it's well embedded in the minds of active Latter-day Saints what they already believe. He's not going to change their minds about that, right? So I think it is true, however, that it's harder for religious messages that are tinged with politics to break through than it used to be, because the political identities are so strong. So, and I think the challenge for some Latter-day Saints, especially those on the political right, is that unlike 2008, if you were in California and you were on the side of gay marriage in California in 2008 and you're a Latter-day Saint, boy, that's rough. The church made it clear in their public positions that it was possible to be in that space. You could be hold a contrary position to the church and be an active, faithful church member, but that didn't make it easy for those folks. The tables have turned in some sense. So now, if you're a mildly left of center or moderately right of center Latter-day Saint, you're pretty comfortable. But if you're anti-immigration and pro Donald Trump and so on, and anti-vax and so on, you're going to be made very uncomfortable. And we've seen evidence of that in recent years, that the church's statements, even though they don't name Donald Trump by name, they don't take direct aim specifically at his policies very often. It's made some Latter-day Saints on the right now very uncomfortable. And that's produced some tension that I think was true before for church members on the left. There just weren't nearly as many of them. Right. To be uncomfortable.
But if the language is vague, it gives plenty of room to maneuver for all sides, correct?
Yeah, it does. It does. Yeah. So if the church really wants to move attitudes, there's nothing like repetition and specificity and messages that come right from the top. And those aren't very common. The church has a religious mission. It doesn't have a political mission. So they don't do that very often. They do it when they see it as in their interest to do so, and those lines don't line up very often.
Also, Chip, if the prophet of the LDS Church happens to be listening, using the language, I'm speaking as a prophet, not as a man, right? Because that is what I've heard used by both sides. People on the left, people on the right, will say, "Oh, he was speaking not as a prophet; he was speaking as a man." When they disagree.
Yeah, Yeah, I don't know. I think they've made clear over the years when they're speaking these days, they're speaking as a prophet. It's particularly true, right? If they sign it as the first presidency, or if they sign it like they do some of these public proclamations from the first presidency and the Council of the 12, they don't sign those unless they all agree on the language, right? They don't. And these days, I don't think they make public pronouncements in a big way about something that touches on politics without agreement, right? In the days post-correlation, silence can mean two things. It can mean that they don't want to talk about it, they haven't considered it, or it could mean some of them want to talk about it, but they don't have agreement, and so they're still working out what to say, if anything. And we don't know because they don't publish the minutes of the meetings, and they don't tell us when they're considering something, right?
Oh, if only they did. So okay, yeah. So.
Battled it out in the Salt Lake Tribune in warring op-eds.
That's very unlikely. I don't see that happening anytime soon.
But I mean, we'd be open to it. And so this is a very Utah and America-centric conversation. What about globally? How do you think that the church's increasingly global nature impacts what the brethren are willing and not willing to speak up on?
Well, I think it matters a great deal because I think increasingly the church is global. In fact, we know for a long time now, there have been more church members outside of the United States than within. The fastest growing areas in the church are places like West Africa and Africa, the African continent generally. And I think those are places in some cases that have much more politically conservative stances. And then you contrast that with places like Western Europe and other places where, they're much more progressive. And so I think that very likely just leads to more caution and a deference to allow for area authorities to do this rather than having it come from the first presidency. So you can see some involvement. So this is the example I would give for that. When the church spoke out against the marijuana ballot initiative in Utah in 2018, it was not the first presidency. It was the area presidency that sent that email. So they sent an email to every church member in the state of Utah for whom they had an email address, I believe, right? I think that's what they announced. I got the email, and it was very clear and very detailed about their opposition. And we had some data collection in the field when the email went out. And it's very clear in the data from one day to the next, with I assume a lot of people getting this email that are in our respondent pool, among active Latter-day Saints in particular, the people most likely to get the email and most likely to respond to the message in the email, attitudes shifted by a measurable amount in our data, pre-email to post-email. And so even an area authority in Utah is going to matter. And I think you would defer to area authorities to do this rather than the first presidency in a global church, right?
But that measure still passed.
It did. And part of
it was because the church supported the concept of medical marijuana. They had come up in support of that. Right.
I guess it's important to bring that up because in the context, the email went out, I believe it was during the summer, well before the campaign happened. And it had the effect of kind of freaking out the proponents of it and drawing them to the negotiation table. And the church negotiated in good faith to basically say, look, we're not opposed to all medical marijuana. We're opposed to some provisions in how you've written this initiative. If you'll agree to allow for some changes to occur after it passes, we'll stand down and we'll, step aside and not have a campaign. We won't campaign against it anymore. And they agreed to it. And in good faith, they talked the legislature into a special session in December, and they did exactly what they asked for. And now we have medical marijuana with the changes the church wanted. And had they spent $2 million or $3 million in opposition with the messages that were being tested in that campaign, targeted at church members, I don't think it would have passed.
Could have had a different fate.
It would have had a very different outcome.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to ask you to put your prognosis hat on just for fun. Do you see the church currently poised to take on any particular issue?
Oh, I'm really reluctant to prognosticate about that. I mean, I don't foresee anything. No. And that's really not my job. I think my job is to look backwards and look at data and collect data and interpret data. It's certainly not my job to see them doing anything particular. I mean, the only thing I would say is they're likely to take positions consistent with positions they've taken in the past. So they don't switch sides on an issue very often. Okay. Occasionally they'll sort of switch their tone or switch at the edges of an issue. And I think LGBT issues are an area where they've sort of they haven't switched their position on gay marriage, right? The church is still opposed to it, but they've softened in terms of favoring anti-discrimination laws, in terms of favoring the Protect Marriage Act that allows for gay marriage nationally. So that's not insignificant. That's a big deal, I think. But they're still consistent with their sort of doctrinal opposition. So I guess I don't see anything that would dramatically change their position from what they've spoken out on previously. And what would likely happen is reiterating something that they've already said with more clarity, or clarifying it for a particular context, if anything.
Quinn Monson, thanks for joining us.
No, it's been a pleasure. It's been fun to talk about this.
And thanks to Dave Noyce.
Always a pleasure.
And to our producer, Chris Samuels. We remind our listeners that they can keep up on all the happenings in and about the church by subscribing to the Salt Lake Tribune's free Mormon Land newsletter. Just go to sltrip.com to sign up, and we'll talk again next time on Mormon Land.